Hey everyone, welcome to this conversation I had with Julia Keller. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a novelist, playwright, and a teacher, and the author of the book Quitting, The Myth of Perseverance and How the New Science of Giving Up Can Set You Free. It was a very enlightening conversation. As if you've been following my work, you'd know that I tend to be quite abstract in my thinking and a bit more esoteric, let's say. And I've been, in fact, also quite critical of the self help industry and kind of the ideologies they promote. And interestingly, as I was writing on Byung-Chul Han's book, The Burnout Society, I saw Julia Keller appear on the Dave Pakman show. And then she was talking about her book, Quitting. And I realized I deeply resonated with her ideas. And after now that I've listened to the book, I read it, but I listened to the audiobook, I found that so much of what she says makes sense. That also, it's a very practical book. It's a very palatable book. And in many ways, she does point out certain problems with our culture that we need to have a conversation about, pertaining to topics such as quitting, grit, and perseverance. So before we get started, though, a quick housekeeping note. Unfortunately, in the middle of the conversation, we had a few problems with our connection. The internet decided to quit on us, but that was a terrible joke. I'm sorry. And therefore, there are going to be parts where the flow of the conversation was kind of interrupted. But I'll edit it out and hopefully it's a bit more listenable. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Julia Keller. All right, so for starters, a very general question, Julia. What made you want to write a book on quitting?
I had been thinking about it for some time. It actually predated the pandemic and that sort of renewed emphasis on people who were leaving their lives, who were suddenly discovering the brevity of life and deciding that you really need to do what we want to do. This really predated that. I had been thinking for a long time about the literary works that have this idea of quitting at their core. And it's one of those things where once you see it, it's like if you buy a blue car, you see blue cars everywhere. Once I began to think about quitting, I began to see it everywhere. I started thinking about great literary works, the classic works of literature, Moby Dick and Bartleby the Scrivener by Melville, all the way through to popular culture. And I began to see this notion of quitting, this quitting conundrum at the heart of everything. And then I just kind of casually began exploring the neuroscience of quitting and talking with some neuroscientists about their work. And come to find out that it's at the very threshold of some of our contemporary neuroscience research. Quitting, meaning whether to stay or go, each decision we make, whether to stay where we are or to go down a different path. And I also then began to talk to evolutionary biologists and others, just kind of gathering string for a while. And then I began to talk with just regular people, which is kind of my background as a journalist. I used to love doing many, many, many more interviews than I would ever be able to use in a story. I was kind of flooding the zone and kind of coming up with all the information you can and then culling the best stories from it. And I discovered that everybody has a quitting story. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to use all of those elements in a book? Looking at the literary perspective of quitting, look at the way that authors have utilized quitting as at the core of their stories, looking at the sociology of quitting, the way it manifests itself post-pandemic, people making other decisions about their lives. The Great Resignation, it was called, although I think the numbers somewhat belie that very grand, momentous title. And also looking at quitting just from the everyday perspective, all of us. As I said, we all have a quitting story. Mine are sometimes very small things, sometimes very large things. And what is it about that? What is it about the stay or go decision? Why is that so much at the very heart of what we do as human beings and who we are as creatures on this planet?
Yeah, so in one part in the book, you mentioned that, in our culture, we're generally told quitting is a bad thing and
Yeah.
perseverance is a good thing. And in fact, your book, the kind of subtitle is The Myth of Perseverance, right?
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
Although you do point out in one part that despite kind of the ideology of our culture is you should never quit, you should persist at all costs, you gotta persevere. That if you look at it from an, let's say, a macroeconomic lens or like a sociological lens, quitting is in fact a sign of unhealthy culture. You state that that means that, for instance, employees have some kind of optimism in the economy, they're quitting their jobs and they're trying new things, maybe starting their own businesses, starting their own projects. So what I'm curious is if, let's say, from our material reality, day-to-day reality, what the findings of economics or even other fields like neuroscience or whatnot tells us that, I don't know if this is the proper term, objectively quitting has benefits too. Why is it that as a culture, especially for us in the West, quitting is viewed in the bad light?
Oh, it absolutely is. In fact, I was talking with a friend the other day and said, "Aren't you worried that if you preach that we should quit, that quitting is good, that kids won't get the message that grit and resilience are good?" And I said, "No, I'm not worried about that at all, because every Nike ad, every T-shirt slogan, you walk in a health club and the walls are emblazoned with all the slogans about not quitting. Everything we're taught from the time we're in the cradle is all this idea of grit and perseverance." Now, I take your point that it is a sign of nimbleness to quit things. We know that flexibility is good from a very, very granular point of view. Just the very neurons in our brain need to constantly rejuvenate themselves by changing our paths, making other decisions, switching things up all the time. And yet we are taught this lesson about hanging in there, not just in sports, but in everything. One of my theories is, and from the book, is that very clash right there, that very clash is indicative of a kind of a deeper restlessness within our economic systems that we have today.
Yep.
I maintain that since the Industrial Revolution, there always has been this discomfort, because we know we have a few winners at the top, and at the bottom, the vast majority of people who aren't doing so well. And that disparity in income inequality has only gotten bigger and bigger and bigger throughout the 20th century and then into the 21st. Until now, it's quite epic and quite disturbing. When the Industrial Revolution got underway, the same thing was true. You had a very few people at the top who were doing very, very well, but mainly you had the vast majority of people who were lying in the gutters, who were starving and living in rags and living in terrible poverty. For a thinking, feeling person, that's very hard to take. If you're at that top and you're looking down and you call yourself a good Christian, you call yourself a moral person, decent person, how do you live with that? How do you reconcile yourself to that? I maintain that's one of the reasons why this idea of grit and perseverance, and indeed the very self-help movement, which was born in the middle of the 19th century in the United Kingdom, that's one of the reasons why it took off and why it became so popular and is held on in such a stubborn way throughout all of these decades, to the next 2 centuries. I maintain that's exactly why, because it gives us cover to put up with income inequality. And that's why I think it's so dangerous, because we should be made uncomfortable by what we see around us. And one of the things that capitalism doesn't like us to acknowledge is the sheer chance, sheer happenstance that has such a large, large, large role to play in our lives. We love to think that it's all our own hard work. If something good happens, we say, "I worked hard, I deserve this." And if something bad happens, we have to look around and say, "You know what? I got screwed. A hurricane swept my house away. A flood came along and took everything. I invested in the wrong stock. I was misled. I trusted the wrong people." Probability rules our lives to a much greater extent than we're willing to acknowledge. And so, to me, that's where that fundamental fissure occurs, is between what we want to be true, which is hard work always brings rewards, and if you don't work hard, you won't be a success, and what we know is really true in our hearts, which is so much of it is simply chance. I always joke, as you know in the book, that do we really think that Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos worked harder than everybody else? Did Elon Musk get up earlier in the morning and stay later at the office? That's a nice idea. It's a nice fable. We know it's not true. And I think those fellows themselves, and very wealthy people who are honest with themselves and with us, will admit lots and lots of luck involved, lots of luck involved. But to acknowledge that puts us in a very different place. We have to stop the worship of the people at the very top of the economic system. So that's where our worship of grit and perseverance becomes not just a bad idea as we go about our lives, but positively dangerous, because I maintain that it keeps us from doing what we need to do in society, which is to look and say, boy, that's just not fair. We should try to make a system that's more fair, that recognizes that certain people are born with physical or emotional disabilities. Certain people have bad things that just happen to them. As you know, I have a chapter called "Things Just Happen," meaning they just do. You don't cause it. I mean, the people in Maui didn't cause those wildfires. It wasn't because they slept late one morning.
Yeah.
Things just happen. And if we believe that grit and perseverance always works, then we're in kind of a bad space, because obviously it doesn't. So it's a long-winded way around the barn there, but just to say that I do think that that's where that disconnect comes from, is trying to reconcile our various fates as we look at the great income disparity and social inequality that is just pervasive around the world today.
Well, yes, I certainly want to talk to you about self-help. I think that's something I want to explore a bit deeply, because it's, in a way, in my really small way, something I've been writing about, kind of critiquing self-help. And it's really interesting. Your book, I don't know, on Amazon or wherever, when they put it up, are they going to put it up under the section of sociology or self-help? Because it's more like an anti self-help book, but I'm not really sure where to put it.
Totally. I had the same reaction when I saw the publishers even were promoting it as self-help. And I said, excuse me, guys, you do realize that this is like critiquing self-help. I think self-help
exactly.
is quite bad. And it's like, what you gonna do? But you're
I
quite
feel
right.
like it would be an interesting sort of a juxtaposition between what's the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and then your book, Quitting. It would be an interesting contrast.
Completely different view. Yes.
Yeah. So you have a great part where you discuss, and it's very, very pertinent, especially you talk about Theranos, so Elizabeth Holmes, and then Adam Newman, the WeWork founder.
Yes.
And then recently, I'm sure you followed Sam Altman, sorry, not Sam Altman, the Bankman-Fried, that's guy, the cryptocurrency scam, whatever. So, I'm in fact, my day job is outside of this podcast, is I'm a software engineer, so I'm very within the startup world, tech culture. What would you call it? Hustle culture, grit, perseverance. And in fact, I'm probably gonna leave your book in my office. We've got like a shared library, just to give people a different perspective. I would say our company, fortunately, our company has a pretty, I think, sane view of let's say hard work, persistence, whatever you may call it. But I've certainly been a part of certain startups and tech companies that just, you work 16 hours a day. You keep just going through all the money. You never give up. Keep getting more money from investors until eventually you either go bankrupt, or the very, very rare moments you at least break even, let's say. So but anyway, that's
the ethos. Yeah, that is the ethos totally of the tech world, which is, work hard. It's how hard you work. Is that light on in the middle of the night? And yet we know that isn't always the case, because to me, if you look at the great tech innovations and fortunes and all that, it's often from pivots. It's often from the innovation itself comes from the pivot, the change. You mentioned like Theranos and WeWork and those. And the question I had, just as an outsider looking in, was like, why didn't they just quit? I mean, you look at Elizabeth Holmes, bright woman. I think not a bad person. I mean, people might argue with me, but I mean, these aren't terrible villains. Maybe not even Samuel Bankman-Fried. I think they get to a place, and of course, we this is sunk cost fallacy. They get so far into something and they don't want to quit. That quitting looks bad. Quitting makes it look somehow like you're unserious. And yet, if they had quit, they would not be where they are today. I maintain. Again, these are not evil people. These are just people who I think absorbed that anti-quit ethos way too deeply and then couldn't get out of it. But you're quite right. The tech world is very much one of who works the hardest, and you put in all the time and you don't shower, and you know more about it than I, but just from the outside, that's what I see. It's this idea of like having the Cheetos and the Dr. Pepper at the desk.
Yeah. Oh, in fact, we've now got showers in the office, so they don't ever want us to leave the office. We've even got like little nap pods and all of that.
Right.
But interesting, Julia. So one of my favorite essayists, I disagree with him very much politically. He's too right wing for me. But Paul Graham, he wrote this very famous essay, I think back in 2010. It was kind of like a lot of these startup founders were kind of it was like their Bible, his like book of essays. He says that startups function like a cult. So everyone's got to buy into the vision, and that's the only way to kind of for this to work. So I'm wondering, from all the research you've done, from from all the interviews you've done, and just generally your background as a writer and a journalist, I do have a lot of people who do work in the startup world who do follow my podcast. What advice would you have for, I wouldn't even say for, let's say, a big C-suite executive kind of founder, but just an average person like me, just an employee at a company who specifically a tech startup, just generally on the themes of quitting, grit, and perseverance?
See, and here's the thing. It's absolutely true that if for an entrepreneur or for any kind of a startup, of course you have to work hard. Of course. It's not anti-hard work, but I suppose what I'm arguing is kind of an ethical kind of hard work, a strategic hard work. If it isn't working, change it. You don't have to completely throw it out. I have a chapter in there I call the quasi-quit, a pause and a pivot.
Yes.
To be more strategic about your quitting or not quitting. Instead of, you don't just throw everything out the door. It's not like a toggle switch and on off. It's more of a rheostat dial where you're turning a little bit up, a little bit down, where you're constantly adjusting both your own efforts and the efforts of your colleagues and your employees, as it were. I think that's what we miss sometimes with this grit and perseverance. We think it has to be this all in. And of course, sports is a great analogy. Tech startups and sports are probably the two places where you see that most often, where you see this grit ideal carried to sort of absurd proportions, because we just don't know quite how to make that, how to have that balance between working very hard, which again is a good thing. We love hard work. I mean, I had a very hard work day today. I'm writing another book, and I probably worked 5 or 6 hours, and there's nothing that feels better. I know you know that feeling as well.
Oh no, I mean, looking into your resume, I can certainly see you can't achieve what you achieved not working hard. I totally agree. Yeah.
But not all the time. That's the thing. I mean, I've published a lot. I left formal journalism in 2012, and since then I've published 11 books in a little over.
I'm trying to write one book.
Well, it sounds like a lot, but on the other hand, I said you ought to see me on some of the days when it's not going well, and I'm sitting with my feet up, patting my dog, scratching him behind the ears, watching a silly TV show. So it's not all the time. I have sometimes when I just know you have to have that strategic quitting. And if you know when to strategically quit, that also means that when you do go back, a couple hours pass, it's like, okay, I'm rejuvenated now, I've recalibrated. Then when you go back, it's not only a matter of just being refreshed in a physical sense, you also are refreshed in a mental and emotional sense as well. And if you try to push too hard for too long, you're going to have diminishing returns. But again, I always make the point too that quitting is not easy. It's not easy to know when to do it. It's not easy to know how to do it. It's a very individual decision. It's actually a very intimate decision. I think it's one of the most crucial and intimate decisions we make. And it's not always right. Sometimes we quit too soon or we quit too late. It's finding that precise calibration of when it's best to, all right, I need to change here. This isn't working. And that's what I think that had Theranos, had WeWork might be a slightly different case because there might be a little more issues involved in that. But I think the Elizabeth Holmes, I think that's why I was immediately drawn to her story, because I admired what she tried to do. I think she had a very benevolent vision of what she was trying to do. But when it became clear it didn't work, quit, move on. Don't fall victim to that sunk cost fallacy. But I do take your point, though. I mean, I don't mean at all to denigrate hard work or grit. In fact, writing this book was kind of odd, because I think the people that know me do think of me as, oh, she's such a hard worker. Well, I'm probably not. Probably a lot of it is just PR. However, I do think that ability, and this may take our whole lives to do this, and we get better and better at it, I think the more times we do it, to know when to be flexible, when to be nimble, when to change what we're doing and how we're doing it, is really maybe the secret of any kind of achievement lies right there in that decision. The stay or go decision is what the neuroscientists call it.
Yeah. Although, and here's probably where, Julian, if you don't mind, I'm going to challenge you a bit.
Absolutely.
I've been thinking about this a little bit, right? So, and this idea really was put in my head by this book, Burnout Society by Byung-Chul Han. And he calls our culture, the culture we live in, the achievement society. So his thesis is very close to what you're arguing for in your book too. He talks about, he essentially what he says is, we live in a society of hyper positivity. So our society has too much positivity. So toxic positivity, to use another.
I love that phrase. I love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he says that what we kind of need is a bit of negativity back in our society, because traditionally we had too much negativity. It was the society of prohibition, but and then he says now we've gone all the way to the other side, where with like the self-help culture, this new age movement, it's all about go, you can. So the society of the past used to be the society of you must not, but our society is all about you can or you should. So examples would be you should achieve all your dreams, you should live your best life, whatever, all these self-help cliches, slogans. So with in apropos quitting and your work, I'm wondering if what your thoughts would be that sometimes it's okay to just quit, not to move on to something else or move on to try out something new, but just quit. So not quit as a means to an end, but rather
Like
make
just
quitting
quit.
just the end in itself. What are your thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah. No, in fact, I deal with a couple of those in my own life. As you know, I started out, the first example I give when I quit grad school. I mean, it was just a terrible situation. I was
You were 19,
really
or yeah, I
bereft.
remember you writing
Yeah,
about it.
way
Yep.
too young. And again, I wasn't any kind of project. It was kind of a weird situation where I was able to cobble together enough credits. Terrible idea. I had the emotional maturity of about a fourth grader. And there I was in a situation where I was maybe intellectually prepared, but emotionally completely unprepared. And it was a dreadful time. But I just quit. That's just as you say. It wasn't, I didn't go and try to cobble together a better situation or try to recalibrate or go and say, well, can I defer my admittance to another semester? No, I just quit. In fact, the only reason I actually formally withdrew from school and didn't just flee, which would have been terrible because then I would have gotten, failing grades in all the courses and would have been a lousy thing to do as well because I was a TA, so I had courses to teach. I actually went and had to formally withdraw and all that. But my impulse was to flee, and I just quit. I take your point. Sometimes you just quit. In fact, I'm glad you said that because when I speak about this, I'm usually challenged from the other end. It's always like, well, but why? How can quitting become a positive? And as you're saying, maybe it's not, and maybe it's okay that it's not. There are things that we do where we just decide I've had enough, and I think that's kind of an act of courage. I do. I think the courage to quit is a greater challenge than the courage to persevere, because perseverance is kind of easy. You get so much reinforcement from society. If people hear you've tried something multiple times, you get a lot of pats on the back, a lot of you got this. In fact, that just happened to me recently. I was doing something and a friend of mine was going, you got this. And I turned around and I said, no, I don't got this. I wanted to quit. And I kept hearing that, you got this. And it became really annoying because, to take your point, I knew I didn't have it in that moment and I wanted to quit, and quitting was the best thing to do. But it said, you got these people, said, no, I definitely do not got this. All right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that's quite right. And I think in terms of child rearing, which I mentioned in the book as well, as you know, I think we put that in kids all the time. This idea about you'll get through this. You'll be able to, well, maybe you won't. And again, and maybe that's all right. Maybe that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's just how it is sometimes.
Yes, and I think recently what I've been embracing is don't think negativity is always a bad thing. As in, oh my God, I'm not gonna obviously mention his name here, but in my first job when I was in uni, I worked as a part-time software engineer. I was studying at U American college. In Australia we call it university. And I remember I had a boss who used to come and tell me, no complaints, no problems, only solutions. And I thought that was terrible advice because, first of all, I was 18. What do I know about solutions at a tech company? Also, how can you even think of bringing up something? Because problems, whenever we brought up a problem, it was framed as being something negative, which is like inherently evil or bad. But
right.
I think
don't even use the word. Yeah.
and what I've found is like reading your book, reading more books on like sociology. It's like no, negativity has a very valuable place in our human reality, and it's not that sometimes saying no it's in fact a good thing. So I found that quite interesting.
No, I like
So
that a lot. That, as you say, if you've been in places where they'll say, as you say, you can't use the word problem, they'll say, no, no, no problem. It's a challenge. And it'd be like, no, 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 it's just a problem. It's a dead end. All right. It's
yeah,
just not going to
I
work. Yeah.
cringe. This is typical, again, going back to your previous one on the startups and the tech world, typical startup tech speak. Uh, very much functions like a cult.
Yes.
So, so Julia, I'm so glad that I know right before we started recording, we were talking about Max Weber, and as if you recall, when I initially reached out to you, I said that I'm more interested in viewing your work through a sociological lens. So I'm wondering if you could kind of flesh out and expand on this phenomenon of quitting, or let's say the phenomenon of not quitting, and then grit and perseverance from the lens of Christianity, capitalism, and then what Max Weber points out in his book, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of
Yeah.
Capitalism. Yeah.
I think that linking, as I said, that Weber was able to do the linking of capitalism with the Protestant work ethic that's really quite brilliant, because those are these two incredibly important currents in thought and in human history. And it was all kind of emerging in the 19th century when this was all getting going. We had the Industrial Revolution, we had all this happening. The world was changing in ways heretofore unknown. Um, the way we got our bread was changing. The way we communicated was changing. Everything was changing. The possibilities for people, seemingly the possibilities for people anywhere on the economic spectrum to lift themselves was just becoming extant, was just becoming something we were aware of.
So just to remind you, we were talking about you were kind of explaining the part about, yeah, I would just say the words capitalism, quitting, and Max Weber, his kind of sociological analysis apropos capitalism and Protestantism.
Right, right. And that Protestant work ethic. I
Exactly.
think why that's so important is none of those things are inherently bad. I mean, I'm not anti-capitalist whatsoever. I mean, I think capitalism has, as they say, as we like to say here in the United States, raise more people up out of poverty, yada, yada, yada. All true, all absolutely true. However, there are people who are left behind through no fault of their own. And the Protestant work ethic has been kind of used as a cover for that, as a kind of a way to camouflage the fact that some people, not through their own fault, are left behind and haven't been able to enjoy the fruits of capitalism in the way that they should. So, as I said, I think that that's where this quitting ethos and this great celebration and valorization of grit and perseverance has this kind of dangerous bad edge. And again, it makes us more insensitive to the plight of others. And it is that, and again, the brilliance of that linkage is because it explains how we got here, why it was an appealing philosophy to believe that if you work, that's a 2 + 2 = 4 equation. If you work hard, you will succeed. If you don't work hard, you won't. It's a lovely fable, and it is only a fable, and it is not true. And we want it to be true because it fits in with this idea about we're rewarded for our good works, as that's, this part. So many religions are based upon the idea of good works. If you are a good person and you do good things, then you'll end up in heaven, and if you're not, you won't. Although I've always liked the Mark Twain line when he says, "Heaven for the climate, hell for the company." Right.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
We all
Also, I
are good
think
people.
also I
Right.
think Oscar Wilde said that I'd much rather go to hell because all the fun people are in hell.
Exactly, right. Same idea, and it's undoubtedly true. Um, but it does explain, I mean, these linkages. What I love, and I know you must as well with some of your thinking and reading, is when you see currents of thought link up, and you see ways that they link up that aren't immediately obvious. You have to dig a little bit and figure out why is this happening.
Mm.
And we none of us start from a neutral point. We all start from where our own viewpoint is. And it has always troubled me the extent to which we put up with such massive inequality. Um, we put up with it. We kind of shrug and we say, well, that's just how it is. And the moment you find yourself saying, well, that's just how it is, we're all doomed. When that to me is a kind of a lazy way out, is to say, well, no, it got that way. We make the world. We have created the world that we want. And the fact that we're willing to put up with some of these vast disparities in income and in opportunity means we're not doing a good enough job of being empathetic to the plight of other people and what they may be dealing with. So one thing I hope that comes out of this new conversation about quitting, and I do think there is, it's gotten kind of a renewed vigor with books such as the burnout book you mentioned, and a lot of them out now,
Your work and
is
post, especially
yes,
COVID, as you mentioned, in the
and
book.
looking at this, and I have to say too, you asked me at the outset what was
The
impulse
impetus,
for me
or
to
the,
write this. Yeah. One thing was the book Grit by Angela Duckworth, which became quite famous and became, many, many corporations bought it and handed it out to their employees, and it was their book. I have great respect for her as a scholar, researcher, as a person. She's quite wonderful, I'm told. I don't know her, but by people who do know her. And I really, really don't like that book. I think there's so many things in that book that are elided kind of unfairly. There are so many things in that book that strike me as really, really wrongheaded and even almost kind of dangerous for people to, particularly people raising children or who are supervisors of other people. I'll give an example. Her example in chapter 1, she talks about a class at West Point, and then there are a certain number of men, I think it was all men at that time, who dropped out. And she said, so this is what she did. She went and she looked, and it turned out that the thing that made certain people stay was grit. This idea, grit was the thing. And I remember thinking instantly as I was reading it, but wait a minute, those soldiers who would be soldiers who dropped out, West Point wasn't for them. A military career wasn't for them. They changed their mind. So how dare you say they're not gritty? It's not a matter of grit or not. It's a matter they made another decision in their life, or could very well have. I don't know because I don't know them. But to me, that seemed to be such a very small lens with which to look at a really, really big canvas, which is why we do what we do and how we live with the decisions that we make. How do we justify our own existence? How much do we owe to other people? How much do we owe to ourselves? And to look and to say that grit is the defining factor in whether one succeeds or not, to me just seemed very, very short-sighted and just unworkable, really.
Yeah, and you make a good point about how I think this is like a theme across your book, but even just in our conversation, where it seems, as Nietzsche said, God is dead when God dies. The cultural void, the abyss it leaves, is that we are trying to find some kind of framework or some kind of system that gives our individual lives, but also even our collective lives, some kind of teleology, some kind of, oh, if I do this, then this will happen. And I feel this idea of grit, perseverance, or more of the ideas of that's coming out of the self-help culture, that is becoming our new religion, where, as you rightly point out, we believe it's almost like an act of faith, in a sense, a naive faith, where we think that, if I make it, it's because I worked hard. If I don't make it, it's because I'm some kind of loser who quit, to use the title of
Right.
the book.
Right. And we are there now. Yeah, we do. And that's why I don't like the self-help idea, because that's what it does. It suggests, all right, I'm going to give you a list of 10 things. And if you do these 10 things, then you're going to be great. We do it in terms of, exercise and nutrition, and as well as our careers with relationships. It's like, here are 5 ways that you can make sure your relationship is strong and successful.
Yeah,
And that it's just rubbish. And again, it suggests that everything is in our own hands, and it just isn't. And you look at
that's a really
the,
good point, Julia.
yeah.
In fact, let's go there. I mean, I want to spend a bit of time talking about this because, apart from my kind of sociological interest in the phenomenon of quitting, I think self-help has, when I was younger, when I was like around 18, 19, or even in my early 20s, I used to just devour self-help books, as most people that work in the tech world do. And I realized, firstly, there's something very narcissistic about it. It's just this complete self-absorption where, as you said, 5 steps to do this, 10 steps to do that. You wake up, I don't know, run, have a cold shower, all good things. I mean, I don't think no one's arguing you shouldn't take care of your health or any of that. But there's something very self-absorbed about it. And that's when I realized, firstly, I think I came to the realization that you point out, that no, not so much of what happens to us is in fact circumstantial. It's a part of our social reality. We are not atomized beings, as the self-help world tends to, kind of the ideology of the self-help world is, you're one person, stick it up and you can do it. kind of even a bit like American ideology, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of stuff. So just in general, what are your views on the world of self-help? And interestingly, this is something I learned from your book. So you say that when Darwin published his On the Origin of Species, it's around that time whoever the person kind of the published the first.
Samuel Smiles. Yes.
That's it.
Yes.
I'm really that got so it's because I thought it was a really modern phenomenon. It kind of isn't. It's been going on for a couple of
Yes.
hundred years now, and so just
Mhm.
what are your thoughts on that? Sorry, that wasn't really a clear question, but what are your thoughts on just the world of self-help, how it started,
That's
and
one of those. That's one of those interesting coincidences, as you say. When On the Origin of Species, published 1859, the same year as Samuel Smiles's Self-Help with Illustrations of Character and Conduct, which was the first time there had been a book of that kind. It was filled with little vignettes, little profiles of big achievers in the middle of the 19th century, industrialists and scientists and even artists. And the backbone of every story, the through line through every story was they worked hard, they didn't quit, they were indefatigable, they were relentless and persevered, and it all worked out for them. Again, very nice, but a bit of a self-selected example. But Samuel Smiles himself was an illustration of that. He was trained as a doctor originally, but he'd done all kinds of things. He'd been a salesman. He'd been some businesses had succeeded, some had failed, and then he came across this what became a magic formula. He ended up writing many books with this same idea. He wrote about lives of the engineers, and he would write about all these even financiers and people in business. At the same time that Darwin, of course, was explaining this kind of the way the species would change in order to ensure their survival or attempt to ensure their survival. That's one of those fascinating sort of cross currents, like we were saying, the kind of the way that ideas and things will happen. There'll be certain contingencies that'll just sort of blossom at the same time, and that's one. Yes, self-help is an old idea, but it really got rolling in the 20th century when you had Norman Vincent Peale here in the United States, some name you may know, a terrible man, a complete charlatan named Napoleon Hill, wrote a book
oh
called Think and
yes,
Grow Rich. Those books are awful, and they are still in print. If you walk in a bookstore today, you can get them, and they're at sales conventions. And in a way, I think it's really quite sad. You start reading the book, and it's all about sticking with it. Even if your kids don't have shoes on their feet, just stick with it. Just keep going. Your business will work
yeah.
out. Well, maybe it won't. Maybe you should quit that and do something else. But they're quite odious. They really are. Even reading them today, I mean, you get kind of a foul feeling. And there are people, I think, who are well-intentioned. There's certainly well-intentioned people. There's a whole life coach movement we have now. And again, at the bottom of all of them is this idea that life is very simple. It's a simple equation. Stay the course, succeed, quit, and fail. Stay the course and be happy. Quit, and you'll be miserable, and you're a loser, and everybody will know you're a loser. And there's this deep shame that attached to it. I mean, this idea of shame with quitting something, I think is really unfortunate, and we stick that on the heads of students all the time. We will attach that label to people as a loser or a washout or a bum, and it's really quite unfortunate because it can really sear you. I know that that's one of the reasons why when I needed to quit grad school, I didn't want to. I was terrified. I thought no one is even going to want to talk to me if I quit this, and it was absolutely the right thing to do. But if this were that moment now, and you were talking to me then, I'm sure I would sound completely out of my head because I was just absolutely, I was so stricken with grief and potential shame and everything that I thought was going to go wrong at this moment. I knew I needed to go, but I was afraid that if I went, my life would be over. And some of these emotional thresholds like that, these really emotional watershed moments are quite distressing and can really change a life in one direction or another.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Napoleon Hill, because would you say, Julia, that a lot of the self-help culture, and this is the way I connect this back to my idea of kind of Nietzsche's Death of God, the fact that we live in a secular society, and that there's this kind of a metaphysical abyss in our culture, and would you say the self-help world functions like a religion?
Oh yeah, I think when you mention like yes, a metaphorical, we have to fill it with something. There's what's the wonderful line of the novelist Robert Stone, who said, "There is a place for God in every human life. There's some question as to whether or not he occupies it." And I think it's a wonderful line because it's true. We all have this need for something. Fill it with something. And if if you have a religious faith and you fill it with that, then more power to you. That's wonderful. I mean, there is a great joy, there's a great consolation that many people find within religion, and that's all to the good. But as you mentioned, in a secular society, we have to fill it with something, and a self-help movement often becomes that for people. Not necessarily bad. You always have to emphasize that these things aren't bad in and of themselves. They only become bad when they're unexamined. They need to be examined and interrogated and explored and say, why am I doing this? What am I getting out of this? And that's when I think some real enlightenment can come. This is not, I'm not in any way demonizing, as I mentioned, some of the current self-help movements are the people that proselytize on behalf of certain self-help programs. They may be I'm sure they're fine people. I mean, I don't have any particular quarrel with them, but I would ask their acolytes to ask themselves why this is appealing to them. What hole is being filled with this?
Yeah, well put. And on the part of the examined bit, Socrates famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think that perhaps more than any epoch or any period applies to our time, because it's rather paradoxical that we live in materially the best time we could live in. Materially, we most of us living, of course, I understand, inequality. We have a lot of problems, the climate crisis. I certainly am not, ignoring any of those issues, but materially, we live in such a prosperous time. Nonetheless,
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, it's been said that the poorest person today, will just keep the United States, the poorest person in the United States at this moment, living in miserable poverty, lives better than a king did in like the 1500s. I mean, there is no doubt, as you say, from a material standpoint, we are blessed beyond belief now at this moment in history.
Yeah.
And yet we do find ourselves struggling and asking these questions, as you say.
Exactly. But then also, I think here's where I think that the problem with that kind of prosperity is then let's say books like yours, like Quitting, or even the Burnout Society, or any books that become a bit more critical of our contemporary culture, of our contemporary ideology, or even political, let's say capitalism or whatever. Because this goes back to my idea of that we live in kind of hyper positivity, that anything that critiques or examines our current social reality, it's framed as being cynical or ungrateful, or oh, look, you live in the best time, be happy. But I think for me that misses a dimension of human existence where, you're right, a part of being human, I think, is just constantly be critiquing things and examining things. It's asking questions the way you asked in this book. Actually, why is quitting always a bad thing? Maybe there's a different angle to it.
As you're saying that, Sue, let me just interrupt you for a second.
No, please do. Yeah.
What's occurring to me when you're saying that is, I think we all do ask the question all the time, but sometimes we don't articulate it in the way that like you and I would, or because we read, and not everybody reads, and that's okay too. I always say, people will come to me and say their kid's not reading or doesn't enjoy it, and I always say, who knows? I mean, we all find different ways. But what I like about what you're positing there is that we do ask the question. We just either ask it in a very overt way, saying to ourselves, like, what do I really want to do here? I need to write down my why am I here? What do I want to achieve in my life? Do I want to help others? What do I want to have? Not in a material sense, but in a spiritual sense. We all ask the question, but we ask it in different ways. And just like the self-help movement, we have to figure out what hole is that filling. In the same way, we all examine our lives, but we do it in different ways. And sometimes some of our worst habits and the worst things that we do to ourselves, things that are bad for our health, comes from asking the question, but asking it in the wrong ways. It just, as you were saying that was occurring to me, that we're asking it in kind of a corrupt way because we don't know the proper way to ask it. We're going to ask it. Part of being human is to ask it, but we don't do it in the proper way. And one thing that books do, I think, for people like you and I and the people that we know, is it kind of channels that inquiry. It sends that inquiry down a more promising path where we can come up with an answer, because we're culling from centuries worth of wisdom and perspective and observation.
Yep, exactly. And Julia, I know your backgrounds. You're a novelist and you're a playwright, so you've got background in literature, and I kind of want to talk about Bartleby, in fact, because you mentioned Bartleby in the book, and I love that story by Melville. One of my favorite little short stories I've read. Is that, and here's my qualm with, let's say, again, self-help culture. They do get people to read books. I think a big part of the billion-dollar self-help industry is in fact books. But I would, and here's where I'm probably going to sound a bit arrogant or even judgmental, and I am being judgmental here. They read the wrong books. In my view, they should be reading books like yours, or books on like sociology, philosophy, or even more of the classics. Spend some
Or
time in
Melville.
literature,
So
or Melville.
true. In fact, that's what I tell people. The
Yeah.
best self-help books are literature.
Oh,
Self-help books
absolutely
are,
agree. I couldn't
yes,
agree
yes.
more. Yeah, yeah.
Great point. Yes. Yes.
It's self-help. It's more like almost like existential kind of self-help. It's not even just, oh, how can you do 5 things to make more money. This is like
Right.
the kind of stuff that changes you in a deep, radical way as a human being. Literature, in my
Yes.
view.
And how it's been done before. That to me, whenever I get at a low ebb emotionally, and we all get there from time to time, there's always some book that I can go to that will show you how others did it. Other people faced these same questions with people that lived in the 1500s or the 1300s. They too looked at the sky at night and said, why? Why am I here? I know I'm going to die. What happens after death? Is death the end? The fact that I'm going to die, does that make what I do completely meaningless or filled with meaning every minute? Which is it? And other people have had those questions. And that's what I've always found in literature. That's what it does for me. And by literature, I don't just mean, the Melvilles and the Shakespeares. I mean a lot of contemporary literature too, exploring these problems. But that's my self-help book. I'm so glad you said that. I've never actually heard anyone else express it quite that way. But yes, for me, that's always been true. That's my self-help.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So the other bit, and this is a bit personal for me. Well, a lot of this book is personal for me because it's a lot of the themes you covered. I've kind of experienced them, but also thought about them. Are multi-level marketing schemes. I know you don't really go too deeply into it, but you do mention MLMs, like whatever these companies are, and you do say you clearly say that MLMs exploit our vulnerabilities. And I, unfortunately, was, when I was, again, 18, 19, I didn't even know what an MLM was at the time. So I got sucked into one. And the crazy thing is, Julia, like the way you mentioned, the people were lovely. They were lovely people. They were, in fact, sometimes, I'm a bit of a cynical guy. People are too nice. I don't like when people are too nice. I'm like, take it easy, man. Like, why are you always smiling? What's going on? And 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 I realized, so it's like this was 5-6 years ago now, but still I feel so embarrassed that I got sucked into a MLM, because I don't think, to use a crass term, I'm a dummy or an idiot, but I can't believe that I got sucked into it. But then I realized, oh, it's again, it's how these MLMs, as you said, exploit our vulnerabilities. So just, do you mind, fleshing out that, and what your views on MLMs are?
Yeah, I think this kind of dovetails with our conversation about self-help. What MLMs do is they make it seem as if if you quit, if you try to make another decision and say this isn't working for me, it means there's something wrong with you. You just couldn't hack it. A friend of mine got involved in the situation like you're talking about, and that's what she would say. It was very difficult to get out of it because it was like, oh, sure, well, I thought you were the one who could cut it, but I guess you're just like most people and you're just not able to do it. That's okay. I mean, great. The psychological gamesmanship that went into it. It was really quite dastardly and can be very harmful to people because it's again, you're making the decision this isn't right for you. Should be perfectly fair, should be perfectly fine, but instead it's you're told that there's something wrong with you and that you just can't cut it. You just couldn't do it, and that's part of what they do. I think they keep people kind of sucked in, and that's where it becomes very exploitive.
Yeah. And I guess, the way these MLMs, they market themselves as network marketing, and that got me thinking. You do have a part in the book where you talk about social media. So obviously, social media, I don't think we can call it something artificial anymore, because really most people's lives, for better or worse, I would say more for the worse, are lived online. Their
Yes.
most of their social reality is in fact online. So how will you view the phenomena of quitting in amidst a world of social media?
That's one thing I explore in there, is because when you notice that a lot of quitting now is associated with social media. People make changes in their lives and take steps in their lives, and it is chronicled to a degree completely unknown in earlier years. So the question becomes, is that just more convenient because we are able to communicate more social media, or is there something deeper and more insidious there, where, as you mentioned, our lives being lived online? I think we're just really at the threshold of understanding what social media has done to us as human beings. And I don't mean that in an entirely negative way, not at all. I mean, I use social media, as you say, most everyone does, up and down the age range, up and down in terms of what field people are in, or what economic bracket they may fall into. Everybody basically uses social media, and I don't think we really have any idea yet where that ends. I catch myself occasionally realizing when I'm online too much and what the implications that might be, not just in terms of traditional social media, but also getting my news from online. It is a different experience to read online than it is to read a book, to read a physical book in hands. And that sounds very old fashioned, makes me sound like a real fuddy duddy. And I can't tell you why or how. I just know it's different. And I wonder how our brains are being changed by that. I know they are. I just don't know how and whether it matters and to what extent it matters. But I do think that social media is very much bound up with our self-image, the image we present to others. And that in turn comes back to us as how we view ourselves and our own ambitions and aspirations and who we are as people. And social media is right there in the center of all that. And we're not even close to figuring it out. Again, which is not to demonize social media. It does good things, but like everything, it's a good servant and a bad master. I think it leaves us in a very precarious position psychologically, and perhaps emotionally and spiritually.
Yeah, it certainly is a double-edged sword. So when you were doing interviews and you do cover like a lot of stories about the people you were interviewing, would you say that the reason people don't quit or are very hesitant to quit, is it something more individual, more psychological, or would you say it's something a lot more cultural in this sense? I mean, so let's take the example of social media. People love sharing their achievements on social media, right? But rarely would anyone share, oh, I quit my job, or I left my partner, or whatnot.
I had a colleague, a former colleague, who did that. I was on Facebook one day, and I hadn't seen him in years. I'd worked with him years ago, and he posted on there that he had lost his job. He'd gotten fired, and he had a picture of himself looking glum. And my first thought was, are you crazy? Like, why would you do that? As you say, you're supposed to just put pictures of your wonderful vacation and of
Yeah.
your all the wonderful things that have happened to you, and when your book publishes, and when you get married, and when your kids win a cross country race. I couldn't believe that he had done it. And my own reaction, I thought, was sort of an indication of just what you're talking about there, how social media sort of transforms our expectations of the lives we present to others, our image to others and to ourselves. I talk in there about, talk in the book, as you know, just about people that do choose to announce on social media things they're doing. And I interviewed one psychologist, and his point was, part of the problem is we are indeed flexible people. We change all the time. We're always a million different things, or we have all kinds of influences on us at all times. And that's a good thing. We need to change. But social media also tends to cement our image in a certain way. And if we're going to change that, then we have to go back
Yeah.
online and change it again to our friends and our colleagues.
Yeah, you do mention that was a really good point you mentioned in the book, because you in the most paradoxical way, we were told that social media and the internet would give us this freedom, this infinite freedom. But I feel you make a really good point that what it in fact does is that it locks us in the past. It enslaves us to our past, because it does cement our past, and you can't just shift and make new changes in life. That's really interesting. So now I want to talk about the neuroscience of quitting, because that's a big part of your book. Although I think I gotta say, Julie, I'm more interested in kind of, again, the the sociological parts. And then when you mentioned,
You're a sociology guy, definitely.
yeah, because as much as I like the neuroscience of quitting, this is a bit of a philosophical point. I always find that when it comes to science, there's this interesting thing where we could find. I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not making like a postmodern or science is subjective, none of that nonsense. What I'm saying is that it seems a lot of us, because I'm sure a self-help author can find some scientific study somewhere and be like, look, this is why you need grit. This is why you need perseverance. Like we can
Absolutely.
always justify our views with whatever
Yes.
scientific facts out there. That's not me, saying a science doesn't exist or none of that nonsense. But which is why I'm more interested in like the Bartleby's and the kind of literature and all of that. So yeah, what would you say from your background in literature, it would teach us about quitting? I'll just ask a very, very general question.
Well, the example you raised, a story that means a lot to you, Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville. I've read many, many interpretations of it over the years. I had a professor that wrote just a brilliant, beautiful article once that he felt Bartleby was autistic at a time before that term was
Term
coined,
wasn't
before
even, yeah.
anyone knew what that meant. And it was a wonderful article. He had an autistic son, this professor of mine, and he talked about some of the emerging ideas and theories now about autism, what we mean by the spectrum and all that. And he thought he could see that in Bartleby. I've read other explanations, all kinds of things, that Bartleby's an alien, Bartleby's all this. And that's the great thing about literature is we can have these interpretations and you argue the coherence of your opinions, which is the great late art critic Robert Hughes would say, that's the task of criticism. You argue the coherence of your opinions. So to me, when I began to write about quitting, I instantly thought about Bartleby. And those of your listeners and viewers that know the story, he works in a Wall Street office, and this is in the 19th century. So it's a lot of scribbling work, a lot of work as a scribe to basically they would copy out all the dense legal documents of the time, and you had a staff that would do that. And then Bartleby one day is given an assignment, and he says, "I would prefer not to. I would prefer not to." And the narrator of the story, who's his boss, goes, "What do you mean? Come on, do it." I always imagine being a present day Bartleby. Can you imagine working for Meta or some other place? And you say, "I would prefer not to. I would prefer not to." And it goes on. And of course, it ends quite tragically, where Bartleby in the end renounces not just the work that he's given, but life itself.
Life itself, yeah. And he dies.
In
Yeah.
jail. Yes, yes. And to me, it became one possible explanation. Not saying it's the definitive one, because we all come to it with our own ideas and our own background. But is this notion of quitting, that quitting taken too far does become quitting everything. There is a nuance attached with quitting, and there's a creative aspect of quitting. And when that is jettisoned and the quitting becomes just this kind of relates to your earlier point when you said sometimes we just quit. To quit ultimately with nothing else around, just this blunt fact, this blunt thing called quitting, you sit and you stop. And that's death. That death in effect is the ultimate quitting. Sometimes it's in our hands. We're able to make those decisions. Most of the time it's not, and it comes for us, and then we quit. So it becomes the ultimate metaphor for death. Now, if Herman Melville, off in some realm wherever he has gone to his reward, listening to this might be saying, "Oh, it's complete rubbish. She has no idea what she's talking about." But again, that's the beauty of literature. We come to it with our ideas and we argue them, and we end up having a provocative conversation about it. But Bartleby to me was sort of the wonderful example of quitting when taken to an extreme without any kind of mitigating influences along the way.
Well, this leads us to the question then, and you say there's no recipe for this, but how to quit? How do we make the choice to quit properly or correctly, let's say?
Well, and we can certainly do it better. As I say in there, it's everybody's individual decision. If you came to me and said, "Should I quit my job or not?" I mean, I do get, believe it or not, I will get this when I talk about the book in places and on podcasts, people will call in if it's a call-in show, and they'll say, "I've got this issue. Should I quit this marriage? Should I quit this?" And I'll say, "I don't know." I mean, it's a very private individual decision. However, there are ways to do it better. There is this rheostat dial that I mentioned. There are ways to not do the all or nothing. While we might love the idea of, screaming at our boss and walking out and saying, "You won't have me to kick around anymore," as Richard Nixon did at the end of what he thought was the end of his
Yeah, you do mention that. Yeah, yeah. And
yeah, well, it's a wonderful moment. And don't we all dream of that? Or like being angry with someone and saying, "Fine, you just go to hell." And then, yes, it's lovely, and it never works, and it's a terrible thing to do. So instead of the all or nothing moment, the rheostat dial that I mentioned, that's one way to quit better. And I think to look beyond the quit. As you know, I quote a man in the book who's a physician who counsels physicians who want to leave the profession. In the wake of the pandemic, many people working in the healthcare professions wanted to quit. They had really had it and they were completely burnt out. And he would always say, that's fine. I'm not going to talk you out of it. However, I would like you to think beyond the quit, which is his phrase. Like, what happens in the next moment after you have quit? What lies beyond that? If you don't know, then perhaps you need a bit more reflection before you do it. And I think that's another kind of tip. I mean, if tips there be, I think of the examples in the book that I give, what I call white flag moments, which is people talking about moments in their own life when they've kind of thrown in the towel and gone in another direction. I think of those as kind of tips. And I love, as I mentioned, I love hearing people's stories about their lives. I derive so much from that. Inspiration, instruction. Sometimes just it kind of feels good to know that other people have been through the same dark nights of the soul, have come out the other end and been just fine. It's, to me, it's very inspiring and very helpful, because nobody knows what we're doing. I mean, we're all kind of groping blindly through this thing called life, and we do the best we can.
Totally.
But there are ways to do it just a little bit better, and that's what I hope those tips, in the book do point out a bit.
Yeah, totally. I really like what Soren Kierkegaard says, that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards.
Move forward.
So
Yes,
things
so
only
true.
make sense in retrospect.
It's so
Okay,
true. Yes.
yeah, this is the last question. I think this is kind of important because, again, this is kind of goes back to the joke I was making before, that I'm not sure where to place your book. Is it a self-help book, a sociology book, or so? The problems that you outline in Quitting in the book, as in the problems you identified of in our culture and within individuals, but also some of the solutions that you proposed. Would you say those are? Would you say that they're more effective at an individual level, or at more of a collective structural level? As in, are these things perhaps we should try to put into our education system? And be taught, I don't know, for kids in schools or whatnot. I don't really know the specifics, but are the problems and the solutions more individual, or are they more collective and structural?
It's going to sound like a bit of a cop out, but truly, I think it's both. Because as a parent, you have that you have that individual responsibility as a parent or a partner or a colleague or an employee. But definitely, there is this larger field in which a larger canvas for this, as you suggest. That's why I interviewed several teachers in the book, because I really was interested in their perspective. You would think that any teacher would say, oh, these kids, they just quit too. And I interviewed two older teachers. These were older retired teachers. So it wasn't, to me, they were the ones I wanted to hear, because I thought they would come out of this background of, you work hard and it was quite the opposite. Both of them talked about what a nuanced thing it is when a student comes to you and says, I'm not getting this. Should I work hard on this and stay up all night? I'm just not getting it. And both of them talked about how it was so different with every individual. So wouldn't it be nice if we could construct?
I mean, it was the last question anyway, Julia, but you were in the middle
Yes.
of talking about how maybe we should talk about this idea of quitting, even in schools, and you said you even
Yes.
with your
Yes.
teachers. So please continue.
Yes, exactly so. I think that might be a really good idea, because they're teaching all this other extraneous stuff in schools now, which I'm a little bit leery of. It's like, let's learn algebra first and geology, and then we'll worry about the other. But as long as we're doing that, why not try to eliminate the stigma of quitting and get rid of this idea that grit and perseverance are the only qualities that matter, particularly in like an intellectual pursuit or in a physical pursuit, that there are many ways to approach it. And I just think we'd be, gosh, happier and get things done. Earlier I used the word shame, and I guess that's the one word that really troubles me when we talk about quitting, is the shame that's attached to it, where it leaves us as lesser people. I think when you feel ashamed of something that you've done, it's a terrible feeling, and we do that often with the quitting. So I take your point. I mean, it is both at the small level, the individual level, but also in this bigger sense too. I guess I'm asking us to change the world, but why not? Because somebody has to.
Exactly, and in fact, like it's like what I forget the Beckett quote, that you try, you fail, and you try better.
Right. Fail better.
Yeah.
Yes.
And even on your point, even in physical pursuits, in your book, you mentioned many athletes who've decided to quit, and they they maneuver or they take a different path.
Oh, the
So
Simone Biles example.
Simone
And look at her
Biles,
now.
yes, the
Look at her
gymnast, yeah,
today. I
yeah,
mean, the fact that she quit when she needed to, strategic quitting, a life or death moment, she quit. And look at her now. She is back better than ever. It's a glorious story because it really does prove the point. Her life was at stake in that moment. The gymnastics that she does as such an elite athlete like that, she
mm,
knew she was not physically or mentally ready to perform in Tokyo. So she says, "No, I'm not going to do this." Took a lot of criticism. Now she got some support, but a lot of criticism too from people calling her a quitter and all these nasty names.
so
She to me is a
social
perfect
media,
example.
yeah,
Yes. Oh, social media again.
yeah.
Oh, the worst judgment ever in social media. Um, but look at her now. I mean, she is back doing things that, again, I read a headline the other day. It said Simone Biles is doing things that no other gymnast even attempt, even conceive of. That's how good she is. And I maintain one of the things that make her great is her willingness to quit when she needs to.
Totally. And I know we didn't really talk too much about this, but in your book, you very clearly outline kind of the evolutionary basis of quitting, and you talk about the
Yes.
neuroscience and whatnot. How, in fact, animals quit, and it's us humans. We are the irrational ones that don't
We are
quit.
the ones.
We are
Exactly.
the we
Animals
are the
know. It's a strategy.
yeah.
Only human beings we load all this stuff on it. All these cultural messages on quitting. For an animal, it's like this doesn't work. Try another. Doesn't matter. There's no shame attached to it. You just do it. The idea is survival. And then we could learn a lot from crows and honeybees and finches on Galapagos Island, as I argue in the book.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
quitting is a strategy.
yeah. That's great. Thank you very much for your time, Julia. As I said, I'm going to leave because I've already read it now. My copy in the library of my office, the shared library, and see maybe give all these people who work in tech and startup with their grit, perseverance mindset, a different perspective perhaps, and see where they come from. But yeah, so what's next for you, Julia? What you said you're already writing a book, and what other projects do you have in your pipeline, so to speak?
I'm writing a back to fiction again, and that's really
Yes.
my first love.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
as a journalist, I love nonfiction. As I mentioned, I love listening to people's life stories. So I was thinking of writing a book about siblings, but
Oh,
I'm
that's
writing
love.
a novel. Well,
Yeah.
I like the idea because to me, that's such a core relationship for all
Yes,
of
yeah.
us.
I live with my sister, so it's a very big part of course. Yeah.
Yes, yes, and it's I think just so important. And siblings in literature, it really does intrigue me how we have what siblings do for us, what they don't do for us. It's our first relationships, and I think the loss of a sibling is so profound because this is your history. And I just find that to be such an interesting topic. So I'm kind of gathering a little bit of string on that. But in the meantime, writing a novel that's set during World War II, which was such a fraught threshold time in American life when America really became a superpower. And this is set in a very small town though, and the view from there. So I appreciate your asking. Always trying to move forward and write. But I do quit too if something doesn't work.
I was
Again,
just
as I
gonna
mentioned,
say if it's
if it
not working
doesn't,
out, you're gonna quit.
you quit. And it's you never want to get into that sunk cost fallacy where you think, well, I've
That's
gone
true.
so far with this. No, if it's not the right project, it's not the right project. And we all know that inside. That's something else I maintain. I really do believe we know deep inside ourselves when it's time to quit and when it's not. It's very private, it's very personal, but we do know. We have to sometimes bore somewhat deep within to find it, but we do know.
Excellent. I think that's a great place to end it. I'll leave a link to your website, to your book, of course, and any of your other work in the show notes down below. But thank you so much for your time, Julie. I really appreciate it.
Oh, this has been just marvelous. My head is spinning with new ideas. Thank you so much.
Great, great. Likewise, likewise. I'm very mentally stimulated right now, and I'm gonna need like maybe half an hour to quit for a bit and just take a break because as like yourself, my head's all over the place. Yeah, great. Thank you.